Hey, how you doing, everybody? Welcome back to Big Frog's 4x4. Today, I'm going to be talking about brake drag on my Jeep Cherokee, but it applies to almost any vehicle out there, especially if you go through a big mud pit like this thing went through a couple days ago. There was mud caked everywhere in this thing. I'm going to have to wash the frame. I spent 3 hours washing the radiator because it kept overheating. There was so much mud packed in the radiator. I had to remove the fan shroud, and to wash it out with a garden hose. I also had to replace the alternator on this late at night one night because the alternator decided to die after the mud bog, as you saw on my other video here. And also, one thing you need to keep in mind when you're doing any kind of water crossing, mud bogging, let's say you're out in Colorado and you're crossing a stream. Make sure that all your vents on your axles are up high enough. Make sure their air intake on the engine's high enough. But also when you're done, make sure you check all your fluids. You want to make sure that there's no water got in your differentials, transmission, transfer case, no water in your engine oil. Check all your fluids. Take the time and make sure it's all done. And also, if you have grease zerks anywhere in the vehicle, make sure you grease everything to push that water that may have seeped in there out. Another, make sure that you wash out your frame. Like on a unibody or on the Jeeps, they have a tubed frame, a solid frame. Well, mud can lay in the bottom of that frame and over time build up. So you want to take your garden hose, park on a hill if you can, put the garden hose in there, and let the water run through the frame rail until all the mud's washed out. I usually park on an uphill, and that way there's a hole at the back of the unibody frame that I can see the mud wash out of. Wash your underbody. Make sure that you don't have any grass, anything that's flammable anywhere near your exhaust. After this mud bog I went through, I had all kinds of old grass and straw because it was in an old field. And it was all tangled up around everything. You'll see it in the video. I'm pulling some of it out. Make sure that there's none on your exhaust. You don't want this thing to catch on fire. Alright, let's get started. You're going to need the socket to take your lug nuts off with. On this Jeep, most Jeeps are either 19 or 21 millimeter. You want to pull your wheel off. On the Jeep Cherokee, the brake caliper is a 12 millimeter. And you're also going to need either a large flathead screwdriver or a small pry bar just to pry back the caliper, just enough to get a little pressure off the brake shoes and slide them off the rotor. Alright, once you have the tire off, you got to take your caliper off. To do that, there's two bolts, one here and one here. And then you want to take a screwdriver or something small and just kind of pry back on this a little bit. And you should be able to pry that off then. This is the effects that mud has on your four-wheel drive. See how this pin slides? This pin is C-solid. So now we're going to have to get that pin out and take care of that slider. And I'll show you how. Now while you have this apart, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and clean up whatever you can find left over from your mud bog. I suggest going to a pressure washer, or if you have one, pressure wash all this. Any of this stuff can cause issues. It holds moisture, and you don't want anything to be rotted and fall apart. Also, now's a good time to go through and grease all your grease points that are on the axle. Check your U-joints and that kind of stuff while you have the wheel off. Jeeps have a pretty high vent tube on the axle, and it goes all the way up to the top of the firewall. Before you do any kind of water crossing, mud crossing, make sure your vehicle has a vent tube, and make sure that it goes up high enough that it's going to be above wherever your water that you're going to plan on crossing is. So if you're going through 3 feet of water, you're going to make sure that this vent tube for your axle, transmission, whatever has a vent tube, make sure it's higher than the water you plan on crossing. If not, you're going to be changing fluids. Alright, now, on the Jeep, these things are really easy unless they're seized in there. Sometimes the rust, get water inside these boots and they'll rust inside of this sleeve, this rubber sleeve. And they really got to work to get them out. But this one, it's just loose enough. You can still get it out. Then you want to remove your rubber boot. And the inside of this rubber boot should be clean, no rust or anything like that. If you can't get it clean, then you want to make sure that you get a new rubber boot, and possibly if there's any rust on your slider, make sure you get a new slider as well. You want to clean up all the mud and rust or anything that might be built up in here as well, because this will get rusty. It'll squeeze on the boot, putting tension on your slider pin and causing the brakes to slide not properly. The top will either stick against the rotor or hold your brake away from the rotor, and only the bottom will apply pressure, and your brake shoes will wear crooked. Plus, they'll usually cause you loss of fuel economy because one end of your brake is still dragging. I like to use an oil base to clean up things that are greasy. But what it really does is thins out the old sticky grease or the dirty grease. It makes it really easy to clean. Plus, if you're using an oil like a WD-40 or a PB blaster to clean up old grease or old brake lube or something like that, it also leaves a nice oily film rather than a moisture or water behind. We'll clean up where the boots seal. If you don't get the dirt out of here, if you go through water and that kind of stuff, water can get around the seal of this boot and get back in here. So you want to try to make sure everything is as clean as possible. And make sure, like I said, make sure that you examine the inside of this boot. Make sure there's no rust or old buildup of grease. If it's just old sticky grease, you can spray it with some oil. And work between your fingers. Work it like this. This will thin out the greases that are in there. Now, if your boot's old and it's real brittle, you're going to want to replace it anyways, because if you do this, it's probably going to crack, and then you're going to have water get in there, and you're going to have this issue again. I like to stuff the rag down in there. And that way you can soak all that up. Kind of ball it up. Kind of work it all the way in. Might be able to use a screwdriver and kind of push it down in there if you need to. You can see it's starting to come through the other side. There you go. Get all the old grease out of the inside. Now you want to grab a brake lube. You could possibly use regular grease. I wouldn't, because it's more susceptible to moisture and water and that kind of stuff. A brake lube is much better at handling high temperatures from brakes. So you want to just stick that down in there and get lots of nice brake lube filling that slide. And you make sure that you do both. If you have it apart, and even though this one's sliding freely, make sure you do both. Just get them all lubed up while you have it apart. Right, you want to reinsert your boot. Once again, like I said, make sure that this is clean. There's no rust built up in there. Gotta stuff the rubber boot back down through. Just kind of work it around a little bit at a time. Pull it back through. Now you can install your pin. Now you want to make sure that this pin seats and snaps in at each end. There you go. Then repeat the same thing with the other side. I have to tell you that you can put a small amount of the brake caliper lube in these slots as well. It'll help with feeding the boot through, but also it'll help prevent rust from building up and squeezing the outside of the boot. Alright, another thing you might want to check with your brakes, if your brakes are dragging, is make sure the slides that your brakes ride on. Not all of them are designed like this. Some have clip-in stainless steel clips that hold your brake shoes into place. Your brakes should sit in those clips and move freely. I mean, they're not supposed to be loose. They're not supposed to flop around in there. But the brakes, when you let off, they should relax pressure and apply pressure. So if you can't easily pop your brake out of the clips, then you probably have tight clips. The clips are rusted, or underneath the stainless steel, the mounts themselves have started to rust and put pressure up or down on the brake shoe, causing the shoe to stick. So make sure you disassemble when you take this off, take your brake shoes off, and examine and make sure your slides are all clean. And then get some of your brake lube, like this, and apply to your slides once they're clean. And when you put the lube on the slides, you do not want to put it on real thick because it can attract dirt and dust. So you just want to put a little bit on, and then you'll smear it and thin it out then with your finger. You just want a thin layer. If you make it real thick, like I said, it'll collect dust, and then it'll be almost like a paste. It'll get tacky. Now make sure before you handle your rotor, do not handle the face. That would be the section that the pads actually apply to. Make sure you only handle the outsides, and if you need to touch the face of the rotor, make sure your hands are clean because you don't want to leave oil behind on your rotor. If you have a rotor that fits tight, you can always apply a small amount of lube to the inside of here and the back of your hub, the same brake caliper lube, and make sure you spread it thin. You don't want it real thick as well. I've said this in other videos, and I'm going to say it again. If you compress a brake caliper and you're doing a brake job, check your brake reservoir to make sure that it is not full. So when you compress the caliper, it doesn't overflow your brake fluid all over the underside of your vehicle. Because then you're going to it eats paint, it's very corrosive, and you don't want that all over your vehicle. Now if you're running a single piston caliper like I am on this Jeep, you can use a C-clamp to compress the caliper. If I can hold it and try to do it at the same time. If you're running two pistons and you're replacing your brakes, you can leave, if it's two pistons on each side, not four, two, you can leave your old brake shoe in, put your C-clamp in the middle, and compress your pistons at the same time. Now, if it's 4 piston calipers, you could sometimes get away with putting a small C-clamp on both sides with your old brake shoes in and clamp it back. And clamp it back a little bit at a time. You go to each caliper back and forth. But they make a tool, I think it's like $45 on Amazon from Lissel, or you can get it from a tool supplier like Snap-on or Matco or someone like that, that has a pad that's double left-handed and right-handed screw threads that you ratchet, and it slowly spreads apart and compresses your calipers. So it depends on if you're doing it on a budget, if you want to spend the money on a tool like that or not. I've always just used C-clamps, but some of the vehicles today are getting harder and harder to do that with. In this case, I only need to press it back a little distance, not much. If you see the brake shoe thickness difference, see how the outer shoe's thicker than the inner shoe now? It's because this inner shoe was sticking and wearing on the inside of the rotor. So always make sure you check the rotor, make sure there's no deep grooves and something like that. This will often cause a rotor to warp, which means it'll get hot and it starts taking a deflection in shape. It won't be perfectly balanced anymore. So when you're braking, you may feel a vibration. In that case, you're going to have to replace your rotor as well. Okay, on the back, you got to push these pins, these sliders back, so that they'll slide over. Make sure the bottom shoe is seated in place, top of the shoe is seated in place. Now you can put your bolts back in. Always start your bolts by hand. Do not start them with an impact or a ratchet, air ratchet or something like that. Just take the time and do it right the first time. That way you know you're not cross-threading anything. And you want to tighten everything down. And these just need to be snug. You don't have to go be all Hercules or anything on them. And that way you don't break them and you don't strip them. If you strip them, then you're going to be getting a whole new knuckle and everything. You can't replace this without replacing the whole steering knuckle. Alright, once you have that bolted in place, and since you press your caliper, now you can check that your slides, your caliper, are working properly. There should be no binding. That should slide back and forth easily. Like I said, whenever you do this, make sure you grease all your grease points. You should have one at the top upper ball joint, lower ball joint, your steering. This Jeep, because I have disconnect sway bars, has grease zerks on the sway bar disconnects. Do everything you can possibly reach while your tire is off, so you're not trying to do this with the tire on. Then you put your tire back on and you call it a day. Alright, when I grease a joint, especially ones that the seals are already broken, because they got old or cracked or whatever, these rubber boots, if they're not broke, when you grease something, make sure you wash just for the grease, for the boot just start to swell. If you go too far, you'll actually blow the boot out, and you don't want to do that. But these are already blown out, they're already wore out. Luckily, I have no play in them yet, but I like to grease it until I see fresh grease come out. See the red fresh grease? That way you know you have it filled. The same with up here, you keep pumping, especially, like I said, if the boot is already ripped. You want to keep pumping in the grease until you see fresh grease come out. You don't want that old, watery, dirty garbage in there. Okay, and that's how you fix a brake pad that might be sticking on your rotor. When you jack your tire up, it should spin freely. Now, if this was a front-wheel drive, it wouldn't be able to do that because you'd be spinning the axle that goes into the transmission. But in the front of a vehicle that's four-wheel drive and it's disconnected, your brakes, your tires should spin freely. There may be a slight brake drag, but you shouldn't have to apply a lot of pressure to get that tire to spin. If you are, the brakes are probably holding too tight on the rotor, which will hurt your fuel economy, wear out your brakes prematurely, and wear out your rotor prematurely. As always, thanks for watching Big Frog's 4x4. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and God bless.